right. Okay. So this is going to be a workshop about labeling museum collections. So that means we're putting little numbers on museum collections so that we can connect those items to the things in the database and in the files and whatnot. So if you're thinking this might be labeling for exhibits, this is the wrong flight and you should get off the airplane. And no, you're welcome to be here. But I just kind of wanted to make clear that that's what this will be about. I'm Ellen Carrlee. I'm the conservator at the Alaska State Museum, which sits on Tlingit Ani, that's Tlingit land, downtown Juneau. Zantakihini is the land of the Occoquan Tlingit people. So that's the Wushkitan and the Thenedi clans. And I'm really lucky to be here on their land and collaborating with them when I can. And I'll tell you what we're going to try to accomplish today. I'm going to go through the contents of the kit that I've sent to some of you, and that's still available for purchase if you want to purchase it off the Museums Alaska registration page. And then I will tell you kind of an advanced kit, some more things you might want to have in your collections labeling kit. Then I'm going to go through a little PowerPoint showing images, material by material, of how I have found is good to label things. And then I'll do a little bit of a break because this is like a 2-hour workshop. So if people want to have a break to get coffee or go to the bathroom or let the dog back in and don't want to feel like they're missing something, I'll give a little bit of a break. And then after that, I'm going to give a little bit of a demo of sort of manipulating these materials and a little bit more of some PowerPoint images of troubleshooting. So this workshop I gave a very similar version back at the 2011 Museums Alaska conference in Valdez, and it kind of encapsulates the methods I've found most useful over the last 20 years of labeling museum collections. There are other alternate ways to go, and maybe hopefully some of you in the workshop will have tips or tricks or other things like that. But I guess with that bit of an introduction, I will show you some of the things in the kit, if that's all right. So if you got this kit in the mail, it kind of looks like this. It's like a little box that contains the things that hopefully will be helpful to you. And I have a little booklet in the kit. Everything's going to show up backwards, I think, on the camera, but it goes through by materials and tells you, according to the different materials, sort of some heads up. Think about this if you're labeling those materials. On the back of the booklet, I have some questions that you might want to ask yourself as you're labeling things. One of them is, will applying this label cause damage like new holes or dissolving the surface? Another one, will future removal of this label cause damage? Will the labeling materials run, fade, abrade, corrode, or age in a way that will damage the artifact? Is the label readable? Is it easy to find the label without having to handle the object a lot? Is it easy to hide the label during exhibition or photography? Is the label ugly? What will happen if the label gets wet? If you're in the museum for long enough, you're going to have a water incident at some point. So is the label going to come off if it gets wet, for example? Is the label likely to come off with normal handling or rubbing or abrasion? And is there a compelling and urgent reason to remove any existing labels that may be important to the history of the item? So those little things are on the back of this, this booklet. That's one thing in the kit. I've also got this little envelope here that contains the paper that I like to use for labeling. The old version, like 20, 30 years ago, of museum labeling involved putting on a barrier coat to protect the surface, and then often writing on that barrier coat in like India ink with a quill pen, and then a top coat of something. And we don't tend to use that method as much anymore. Sometimes that doesn't come off as well. The pen can be kind of aggressive, and there's various reasons that I think using paper labels is better and more legible and more reversible. For example, if you've got this thin paper label and you have written on it, it's going to show up on most colors of background. Sometimes you will find museum collections that have kind of that layer of white paint or whiteout with a number written on it, which can be kind of disfiguring and often very difficult to remove in the future if you need to. So a little piece of paper gives you a lot of opportunity to make your label very legible, but also very removable if you need it to be. So the paper that I've put in your kit is photo interleaving paper. So it's a interleaving tissue that's thinner than your usual photocopy paper. Photocopy paper is not bad paper really, but it tends to be kind of thick and it's hard to get it to really lay down and conform to the surface. So I found that if you use photocopy thickness of paper, that you can kind of catch the corner of those labels and they can kind of pop off a little more easily. So this thinner tissue, which I think in the back of this manual, I've listed where I usually get it, which is Hollinger Metal Edge is where I've purchased it in the past, and it's called Phototex interleaving tissue. And it comes in these full-size sheets of paper, which will be, if you get a pack of it, would likely be a lifetime supply. I've included it in smaller pieces that fit in your kit box. And what I like to do is write these labels real small. I forgive me that the camera doesn't show everything great, but then it allows me to cut that into like a little fringe when I'm in the middle of labeling things, and then cut those little pieces off to be my individual labels. Because if you cut them all up ahead of time, you've got like a lot of little labels to lose. But this is kind of a nice technique. We'll kind of get back around to that later. Also, with these nice little pieces of tissue to make the labels, I've got for you pieces of Tyvek. Tyvek is an inert plastic. It's a spun bonded polyolefin fiber. I think it's a nice inert plastic sheet, and you're probably familiar with this material from mailing envelopes that are also made of it. And in fact, I have acquired these for you in your kit by cutting up these mailing envelopes, which I think are a nice source of this material. I cut off all the areas that have adhesive on them or any kind of printing on them, and I just use the bare areas. This is what we're gonna talk about for labeling of textiles and sewn tags. There's also a kind of a Tyvek that's what they call soft Tyvek or needle punch Tyvek. Let's see if I can bring this up to the camera. You can kind of see that that has little holes a little bit on one side, and it's a little smoother on the other side. If you have this kind of Tyvek in your collections care supplies, that's perfectly fine to use as well. Feel free to interrupt if any of this is confusing or you need to jump in, or you can put something in the chat and Dixie can interrupt me if you don't want to interrupt me. I also have these little Avery tags, these labeling tags, because one of the themes you're going to notice in this training workshop is that supplemental and redundant labels on boxes and tags and whatnot is a good thing. So these are these kinds of paper tags on a cotton string. They come smaller too, like little jewelry tags. You can often buy these locally. So I have a bag of these in your kit. I have some marking media. So I have a couple of micron archival ink pens, which is usually what I'm going to use to write on this tissue. And for most of you, I've included 2 different thicknesses of nibs. There's a blue photo marking pencil. So this is for marking those photographs that are on plastic carriers, because often pencil doesn't work so good on the back of those plastic photographs, but this will mark on those plastic surfaces and will erase off of them as well. And then a couple of standard Ticonderoga number 2 pencils. And I like using this kind of pencil better than a mechanical pencil because they're not as likely to scratch or puncture the surface of what you're labeling. I've got a white vinyl eraser. When I am removing pencil labels from things that are paper or books or whatnot, I usually try to use one of these kinds of erasers and not the eraser that comes on the pencil. Erasers stay flexible when they have enough plasticizer left in them to be effective. But as you know from old pencils, sometimes the pencils that are on the end of your writing implement dry out faster, and then you can damage the surface by either smearing that unpleasant reddish orange pencil eraser on your paper, or worse yet, tearing through the paper. So that's why I've got a nice flexible white vinyl eraser in your kit. Then I have for you a jar of B72. This is a kind of an acrylic adhesive that conservators like to use and museums like to use, and it has been popular for decades, partly because it has really good aging properties and it stays reversible for a really long time. It's not as friendly and easy to handle as certain water-based adhesives or other materials that people are more familiar with. It takes a little bit of practice to use it, but we're going to go over some of that. I'm also including in this kit this extra jar. This is just a nail polish jar with a little shaker bead in it, a brush bottle, they also call it. And I'm including both of these in your kit for some very practical reasons. And you will also find a funnel in the kit. I'll get back to this. I'll tell you why the funnel's wet in a minute. But there's a little funnel to allow you to transfer some of this B72 into this brush bottle. So I would recommend that you transfer maybe a little less than half from this jar into this brush bottle to keep the brush in the bottle covered. And the reason I'm recommending this is if you use the brush from this jar, it has a really wide mouth on the jar, which means a lot of surface area. And because this adhesive is in solvent, mostly acetone, it's going to evaporate pretty fast. So you're going to lose product, and it's going to get thicker before you want it to. And it's going to be a little harder to handle. So having it in the brush bottle makes it a little easier to handle. This lid is also going to be easier to get on and off if you get a little bit of adhesive around the threads of your bottle. This lid, if it gets adhesive around the threads of the bottle, is going to be a little harder to get off. I'm going to stop now and tell you why I've got the funnel in water. So when B72 dries, like you can either try to dissolve it back off again with acetone, as you might for getting a label off of a surface of something, or you can, for the funnel, you can just wait till the adhesive dries and put it in water. So I've had this in a beaker of water for a little while. And what happens then is the adhesive just peels out, turns opaque and white, and it'll peel out and come off more easily. So there's a tip for keeping your little funnel clean. That water trick can also sometimes work if you have adhesive up around the threads and you're having a hard time getting your jar open. A bunch of times, smacking that jar really good on the edge of a counter will give you enough ability to get it open. Once the jar is open, let's see, I've got a jar. I got a couple jars here. So here's one of mine that I use a lot, and you can kind of see the liquid is still flowing pretty good in there. But here's one where you can kind of see that it's not flowing so good. It's thicker, and that's starting to get too thick. You can thin that down by adding more acetone. But you'll see if I take the lid off here and I go like this, you see how that's stringy? That's too thick. So another thing I'll tell you, and again, I wish the camera could show you a little better, but you can probably see that there's adhesive kind of stuck around those threads, which eventually is going to make it hard for me to get the lid off of that jar. So what I have here, maybe you've got something like this laying around. This is an old dental excavator. It's a dental tool that became dull, and I got this from the dentist because it's no longer that useful. To take that and just go and pick the adhesive off the threads will kind of clean them up and make it so that the lid will go on good again. Another thing that works good is the like a metal toothpick for appetizers. Sometimes you can even use the tip of an awl, something like that, to clean off those threads. So that's a little bit of your care and maintenance of your B72. Another reason for the 2 jars is that if you don't label frequently and your B72 starts to dry up in the jar, the kiss of death is if it dries up in the jar and your brush is stuck in it. Like then there's really no way to get the lid off without breaking off the little brush in there. And then it's kind of no good. But typically what I see is that one of my adhesives tends to be doing pretty good and the other one seems to be getting a little too thick. So this kind of gives you a backup, and you can use the one that's looking good and maybe add a little more acetone to the one that's not looking so good. So it kind of doesn't leave you high and dry when it's time to be labeling. So a few more things in your kit. I did actually send you some acetone, a little dropper bottle that I put in another bag. I hope that those of you who ordered a kit, it arrived safely. I think it's not really something you're supposed to send through the mail, but it was a pretty small amount, and it's gentler than what's in nail polish remover even, I think. So I felt not too guilty doing that. And then I've got a bunch of Q-tips. These are just standard Q-tips. This is your method of taking the label back off the surface again. Not only does the acetone thin down your adhesive if it's thicker than you want it, but it also is the method that you're going to use with a cotton swab to get the label off of your object if you don't want it on your object. And a little foreshadowing here, if you think that acetone is going to damage the substrate of whatever you've put the label on, it's something not to use this adhesive on. So don't use B72 on anything that you think is going to be sensitive to solvents.
Ellen, were you able to answer all the questions in the chat?
I am not able to read the chat at the same time I'm presenting. So if you, let's jump over there. Okay, let's see what it says. It says, where do you buy acetone? Is the hardware store version okay? I buy reagent grade acetone from Fisher Scientific, which the state of Alaska has a contract for shipping on this, and shipping's a little tricky. If you buy a bottle of acetone this size, it'll last you probably the rest of your career, but not everybody has the ability to buy reagent grade acetone. You might want to check with if there's a university in your area that has a chemistry lab, or even if your high school has a chemistry lab. You really only have to go through the pain of trying to buy it once, and then you'll kind of be set. If you use hardware store acetone, that's a possibility, and it's not the end of the world. What happens with hardware store acetone is it often is contaminated with other substances, most commonly water. So if I were to put this acetone in a beaker and then another beaker with hardware store acetone in it, and I let them evaporate overnight, wouldn't even take that long. Acetone evaporates really fast. The beaker that had the reagent grade acetone from the chemical supply company would be empty. And the little beaker that had the hardware store acetone would still have some liquid in it the next day, probably, which is largely going to be water. And the worst thing I think that's going to happen in that case is it might make your label on your object make it look a little bit mottled and not completely uniform looking. So I think that that's kind of the downside to using hardware store acetone. But if you're in a remote place in Alaska and that's what you have, I think it's, from the point of view of your object, I think it's still okay to use it. What is the percentage of B72 in acetone? So you could talk about what percentage is in here, but I find it much more useful to go by the handling properties and the viscosity and the thickness of the B72 that's in there. So if you see that it's, you know, fairly liquidy, but that this other one that I think I demonstrated is like way more viscous and stringy. When I go to the demo section, I'm going to talk about practicing on something. I've got an old coffee mug that was broken. That's my pencil holder. And if I'm going to come into work in the morning and I'm going to label a bunch of objects. I'm going to start out warming up and I'm going to put some little faux labels on my little practice thing. There's another museum I've seen has a little rock that they practice on putting labels on the rock to just make sure their viscosity of their adhesive is where they want it. Or sometimes I'll use the side of a stapler, like just anything to kind of practice making sure that the thickness is how thick I want it. So the point of the B72 is going to be to put down a barrier layer. I call it the landing strip. That's going to be a little bit bigger than the label. And then to put your label on there, and then a top coat that's going to kind of encapsulate it. And I'll get to this in a little bit, but we have a Band-Aid. And when you open up a Band-Aid, so you got the pad on the Band-Aid that you put over your boo-boo, and then there's sticky all around the edge of the Band-Aid. That's kind of what I'm thinking of. That's kind of what I'm thinking of for the museum label, is I want there to be a little bit of adhesive all the way around the edge to really encapsulate that label on there. So long story short, I could tell you whether it's 5%, 10%, 15% B72. And if you're going to mix up your own B72, which I can go into doing that, it's a totally doable thing. But I think that the handling properties and the viscosity is really the thing to be thinking about and looking at rather than what the percentage is. Okay, Helen Alton is saying, alternative idea, soak a cotton fabric pad and wipe the glass until all the adhesive is gone. I've stuck myself trying to pick it off. Oh yeah, with a sharp tool. Yeah, that's a thing. I get it. So it's true. You can just keep wiping. I mean, it will totally dissolve in acetone. It's totally doable. Angeli says, Alaska Department of Fish and Game Labs have these chemicals and will often share small amounts that we need. Bethany wants a label rock now. Can you refresh us the difference between paraloid and acryloid? I think one of them is an American formulation, one of them is a British formulation. Paraloid and acryloid are the same thing. But the numbers that come afterwards, B72, it's 72 you want, because like B67, or there are different numbers that are afterwards. So the paraloid and the acryloid don't really matter. The B72 is kind of the important part. Okay, I think I got through the questions, but if I missed any, I hope folks will interrupt me. Few more things in the kit. Now we're getting to the good stuff that is why you would have gotten the kit I put together. Really nice scissors. Okay, these are really nice tissue dissection scissors, again from Fisher Scientific. And the reason we could offer the kits at the prices we could is because I got things in groups of 12 or groups of 24 in order to get the discount from Fisher Scientific. So this is a really, really nice scissors. And when you're making your little tiny labels on here, and you're going to cut the little fringe, you can really cut fine, tiny little labels with this terrific scissors. So guard that in your kit. Also in your kit from Fisher Scientific, I have a gorgeous, lovely, super pointy, teeny tweezers. Again, I think this is for dissections and other scientific-y sorts of things. This will be great if you need to get a splinter out as well. Really nice tweezers. And I've got some thread. I've got cotton thread in here. I like cotton thread because it's soft. If you're using like a polyester thread or a synthetic thread, those fibers are harder and they can kind of over time kind of saw through some material. So I prefer cotton thread. And then I've got a selection of needles for sewing on some kinds of tags. And I will give you a tip if you're sewing on like your Tyvek labels, for example, using the pointy end of the needle to sew through, make holes in the Tyvek, but we don't want to be poking through the fibers and the yarns of our textiles, for example. But if you flip the needle over and the end where the eye of the needle is blunt, you can use that to kind of wiggle in between the weave of the fabric, if that makes sense, so that you can get your thread through those elements of the textile without piercing and damaging the yarns. So those are the contents of the kit. Anybody have any questions on what's in that kit? I'm going to tell you a few other things you might want in a more advanced kit things that I've had around the lab that are helpful. Give a second for anybody to interrupt me. Oh, I'm hearing Sue is saying high quality scissors and tweezers makes her so happy. Textile curator is crying with happiness. Nice. The plastic tubey thing. You mean on the end of the tweezers? Is that the question, Haley? Oh, I know what you mean. Does your camera work, Haley? Yeah.
That silly thing that looks like the Chinese finger trap, Ellen.
Right. So I didn't stick that in everybody's kit, but I did stick it in there because when I got these things of cotton thread, they came with these weird stretchy, they look kind of like a finger trap. And I think they were supposed to go through the middle of this and then go on some piece of equipment. But I didn't know what they were. And I threw them in some of the kits to mail them off as a mystery to people. So somebody might know what they are, but they're not technically a part of the kit. Just messing with you. Okay. Okay, some fun stuff for your advanced kit. One of them would be a hole punch that makes a little tiny hole. So I think I got this at Joanne Fabric, and it makes a smaller hole than the usual size hole punch hole. So this is so you can make your own tags, because tags can be kind of expensive. So if you want to make your own little tags, you can make your own if you have a hole punch that makes a little hole. So you don't have a giant hole. If you make a regular hole punch size hole, the hole's easier to tear out. So that's kind of nice. I will say if you're going to get a hole punch that makes teeny holes, getting the best quality one that you can is a good idea, because this one was inexpensive. And when I squeeze on it to try to punch through cardstock or thicker paper, the handles bend a little bit. So that's something for your advanced kit. What else do I have for the advanced kit? Twill tape. So some folks like using twill tape for putting labels on textiles rather than Tyvek, which I think is fine. Although I would say try to get the twill tape that has kind of the, it's not going to show up, is it? Wish the camera could show you a little better, but this has got like a herringbone weave on it, like a very tight textile like weave, as opposed to there are twill tapes that have like much less tight weave. So if you don't have a tight weave, if you try to write a number on it, it kind of bleeds out a little bit. So the tighter, higher quality, more expensive twill tapes are better to go with, and you can get them pretty small too. So twill tape is another item to have in your arsenal. Beading needles, those little tiny skinny needles. Beading needles can be nice for working through like tight basketry or other things that you might not want to put a big fat needle through. So beading needles are nice. I also have this thing called a needle nest, and the back of it's magnetic, and so it holds my needles. Or a pin cushion is a nice thing to have. This is a seam ripper, I think is what it's called. It's again, the focal. Oh, that's not too bad. So you'll see there's a little ball down there that stops you from cutting a pointy thing. And then there's a little sharp thing in there. It's sharp. So you can cut your label back off if you want to. It's a really nice little tool. Thimble. Tyvek tags. Tyvek tags are kind of a plasticky tag. They often have a grommet, which is kind of nice. Unfortunately, they often come with wire ties. So I usually take off the wire ties and I put on cotton string instead. So a Tyvek tag with a grommet can be nice if you're labeling like big industrial collections or bigger things where you want a bigger, more robust tag or label. Often a redundant tag or label to something you've put more permanently on the object, but you want it to be visible easily. If you've got off-site storage, for example, of your industrial collections, Tyvek tags can be really nice too. Let's see if I had anything else terrific in my, oh, this is a good one, you guys. Coin holders. So for really tiny things like maybe beads from an archaeological site, for example, these can be really nice that they're not made of great cardboard, but they're usually lined with inert plastic film like polyester film. And then if you put like a staple here and a staple here, and then you can label the little coin holder, those can be nice. Little bags can be nice for smallish things. And I used to years ago just write on the outside of the bag, but I've noticed that like that can tend to wear off over time. So now I tend to just slip a piece of paper in the bag with the item that has its number on it. So those are some of the supplementary things. And I'll suggest this book. Again, it's going to show up backwards, I guess, but this is Museum Registration Methods, Rebecca Buck and Jean Allen Gilmore. If you don't have this book, it's got so much great collections management stuff in it. It's got a whole section on labeling things, which is pretty solid. This is the 5th edition book. I think it's on its 6th edition. And if your institution doesn't have it, it's really worth having. So there, I think I've described the label kit that got sent and what you might want to add to your label kit. Helen Alton is mentioning that mice don't eat Tyvek if collections are stored off-site. This is true. I have yet to meet a mouse that will eat Tyvek. Spin hole makers at Raintree Quilting, cheap. Yes, spin hole makers are cool. Do they make the tiny hole, Mary Ellen? You can add in the chat if they make a tiny hole. They do. Spin punches are really nice. You can make a hole anywhere you want. If she's talking about the thing that that I think she's talking about. If you've got a hole punch, you can really only put the hole as far as you can get your hole punch. So like that far in. Where a spin punch, you can kind of put a hole wherever you want it. It's a little device that looks a little bit like an awl, and you go, and it makes a really great little hole. Spin punch is great. Haley says she uses a screw hole punch to make custom size holes in Blueboard, and she's got a really nice link. Okay, I think I've caught up with what's in the chat. So unless we've got any more thoughts or questions about the kit, which if you think of anything, feel free to interrupt and share with the group. But I'm gonna, I think, try to share my screen and go through material by material, some tips and tricks for different materials. Does that sound good? Okay, let's see about screen sharing. Can anybody confirm that they see my screen?
We see it.
Yep.
Okay, great. That might be the smoothest screen share I've ever done in my life. I can't see the chat right now. So somebody like Dixie, interrupt me if there's good chatter going on the chat.
Absolutely.
Okay, so starting out here, antler, bone, ivory, tooth. These materials I find take solvents and labels of the traditional kind just fine. So here's a couple of examples of labels on those kinds of materials. And also you see on the left, there's a box that has a supplemental number on it. And if you want to follow along in your little booklet, if you have the booklet, I've mentioned some things. I won't read all of it to you, but for those of you that don't have the little booklet, this page says, beware, sometimes synthetic materials are made to look like this. See the page on plastics. So there's sometimes, because ivory, for example, is a luxury material, they sometimes make things like vanity sets or jewelry out of plastics that are meant to imitate ivory and bone and some of those materials. So always be aware, like make sure you're not getting fooled of what the material actually is. Locating a smooth area that's not flaking or powdery or decorated. Choosing a location that will not show during exhibit or photography. Applying the base coat, the paper label, and the top coat, and then using a paper tag, a labeled box or bag as redundancy to aid in handling. Not having to handle your collections, the less you have to pick something up to see a number, the better. So redundant tagging and labeling is a great thing. So here we've got baleen, claw, hoof, horn. These hard tissues are usually made out of a protein called keratin, and they are usually something, the middle item there's actually antler. Sorry, I'm put that on the wrong slide. But on the left here is one of those Northwest Coast spoons that's made from a combination of sheep horn and mountain goat horn. It takes a label fine, but I've got a redundant tag on that one. The center image is actually antler. And then the image on the right is a piece of baleen, which you see is delaminating. And so the tag has been put somewhere where the delamination is not going to lose the tag. Here's some basketry options. You'll see that I've often had success with tags on basketry stitched through. The AB on most baskets, if there's a basket with a lid, often the bottom of the basket gets the number with an A and the top of the basket gets the number with the B. The coiled basket in the upper right, you'll see has those on kind of long threads, which are kind of handy because you can see them without opening up the basket. But then if you wanted to put it on exhibit, you could just flip those to the inside of the basket and they wouldn't be visible on exhibit. The item in the lower right shows some basketry material where the elements of the basket are larger and you can actually get a tag on them. So cedar bark baskets, for example, might be amenable to a tag like that, and you can usually get those back off again pretty well too. Book and paper materials, generally using a pencil is a fine way of labeling them. Most books I see kind of labeled inside on the top front page like that, because often you don't have to open the book all the way in order to see the number of the book. Sometimes you'll see people put an extra sheet of paper or like a scrap of paper inside the book with the number that sticks up so you don't even have to open the book. I've seen people do that as well. And then if you didn't want that number in there anymore, you could just erase it out with your white vinyl eraser. When you are labeling with pencils, I really recommend that you don't press any harder than you need to, and that you're writing on a hard surface. So not on top of a stack of other pieces of paper and not on top of the foam sheet that we might put on top of tables in collection storage, because the soft surface underneath paper will make it more likely that you're going to dent the paper or even puncture the paper with your pencil. Here are some other paper items. You'll see that on the left, there's a paper item that has like adhesive along the edges and is kind of a thinnish paper. You can see how thin it is. You can see a little bit of the material through it. So if you're labeling things like prints and drawings and paper that might be really thin, think about if you think you would be able to safely erase that number back off the paper. If you don't think you could easily erase the number back off the paper, think twice about numbering the paper directly. You'll see that this item also has its number on its folder. So redundant numbering of supplemental storage materials is a really good practice. Ceramics. Generally speaking, ceramics take these B72 labels beautifully. The surface of a lot of ceramics has a glaze, which is glass. And even when that's cracked or crazed, as you see in the lower left, they still take labels really nicely. We try not to cover up the hallmark or the stamps or anything like that on the underside of ceramic, and to avoid the actual foot. So as it's being put down, that label isn't abraded. But there's a few kinds of ceramics in Alaska that are low fired and they're real crumbly, like the pot in the upper left. And I would think twice about putting a B72 label directly on that, because it might not stay on well and it might cause trouble with that substrate. So it might be that there are more compact, more robust areas of that pot. But also I would keep in mind with that particular dark ceramic that's in the picture on the upper left, that those ceramics are fragile. And if you were to put it on the base where you might be inclined to put a number, you're going to have to handle and move that pot in order to find that number. So if I did see a spot on that pot that was low down on the ugliest side of the pot that was very compact and robust, I might consider putting a number low down on the least attractive side, with the idea that if you were going to photograph it or exhibit it, you would show the other side. But those low fired ceramics, I would be hesitant to put an adhesive label on. So then we've got fur and feather sort of things. It's difficult, of course, to put any kind of a label on fur. So we're talking about redundant labeling. Here's a box of muskox fur where we've labeled the box. I would even consider putting a tag or something inside the box with the fur. And with redundancy, another thing that can be helpful is to make sure you have good descriptions of those items in your database, including a condition report or some mention of condition, because sometimes things that look similar are distinguished by flaws and damage and those sorts of individualizing features that might be captured in the condition, and also an image. So these are different redundant techniques to kind of help prevent the whole point of this labeling, which is to lose the connection between the object and all of its records. You'll see that there can be on some feathers, some larger feathers, you can maybe put a label directly on the quill of the feather, which we see in the right. For gut and leather, I think these materials don't take adhesive labels well, partly because the adhesives migrate into the structure and cause staining and don't make a good bond with the label, but also because these materials are flexible. And if you have a substrate that's flexible, your adhesive labels are not going to stay on well. So most of the time I'm using tags or sewn on labels with most gut and leather. Glass. Glass is another one of those materials that generally takes your adhesive labels very well, except I would say for these yellow beads that have glass disease. So weeping and crizzling glass, which is when you hear glass disease, sometimes you think, oh, it's a contagious thing. Glass disease and weeping glass and crizzling glass refer to a bad composition of glass when it's manufactured. So if there's the wrong combination of ingredients and the wrong ratios in the glass, it won't be stable over time. And you get these alkaline kind of soapy substances that migrate out to the surface of glass. And not only will an adhesive label not stick well, but that glass is much more fragile than stable composition of glass. So I wouldn't put a direct adhesive label on that kind of glass. I would put a tag on instead in a redundant box and probably look at extra ways to be protecting that kind of glass. You'll also notice a lot of glass is pretty translucent, and it can be disfiguring to put a tag or label on that kind of glass. But with a lot of glass, especially like jars and glassware that you might drink out of, the base of it has a spot that the shadows and the construction of the glass will hide the label if you make it small enough and you hide it in the shadow on the bottom. And then on the right, you'll see a container of archaeological beads, glass beads that are held in those nice little coin holders. Here we've got metal. Metal is another material that tends to take adhesive label very well. As a matter of fact, B72 was formulated originally, I think, as a copper coating, intended to be a metals coating. And we in the museum field have just taken it for our own purposes. You'll see the spoon on the bottom has a nice adhesive label on kind of the inside back of the handle. The silver bracelet on the right side has a label on the inside. The center item is a piece of archaeological metal that has not only the museum's number, the one that's 2008-11-99, but you'll see there's also to the side of it smaller numbers in white. That's the archaeological information of the object. And most of the time, if there's already a number or a label of some sort on the object, I will leave it on there as part of the history of the object and part of information that we wouldn't want to lose. Very rarely is it, incredibly disfiguring, and the curator might ask me to remove a label. But even if I were to remove a label, I will photo document it very carefully and make reference to it in its records. The far left item, the one that says 2004-14-1A LeConte hull, is a piece of rusty iron from a ferry that ran aground, and we have a piece of the ferry that ran aground. And so with some items, like industrial items that have really rusty surfaces, or archaeological iron that is kind of spalling, sometimes you can't get a label to stick on the surface. So in that case, I would use a tag. Paintings. Okay, I'm kind of burning through these. Dixie, am I getting anything in the chat right now, or are we cruising
Nope.
along? Okay, cruising along. Paintings. So I try to just label backs of frames, dust covers, those sorts, backer boards, those parts of the back of a painting. I would never try to put anything on the back of a canvas or the back of the painting itself. So you'll see on the lower right, someone has labeled on the very, very lower right corner, the number on the back of the frame. And it looks like there's not even a barrier layer. It looks like they've just used ink. And it looks a little bit like it might say Roman numeral 2A 276, when really the number is Roman numeral 5. It's like a VA 286. And on the foam core backer board, it's been rewritten in pencil, VA 286. So this is one of those ways too where redundancy can be helpful. The pictures on the left kind of show tags, which are really helpful with paintings, because paintings are not as easy to be moving around as some other kinds of objects. And if you have these tags that hang from the wires or the hanging hardware of the paintings, it can make it a lot easier to find the one you're looking for without having to move a lot of things around. So redundant tags and labels are really great on paintings. Here we show some of the labeling on the backs of photographs. So if you have paper-based photographs, like on the left here, writing gently in pencil is effective. And again, having a hard surface below in order not to indent with the pencil, or worse yet, even puncture. And then on the right is an example of that blue photo pencil that I've included in the kit, which writes beautifully on the back of plastic carriers. And erases nicely if you want it off again. Plastics. Generally speaking, I won't put an adhesive label on any plastic because plastics tend to be soluble in the solvents that B72 is in. So you'll see these examples of stuff I had around the lab and in my study collection. So the little rubber cockroach and the cassette case, you'll see that a little bit of acetone on a cotton swab takes up the color off of those plastics. It means I'm dissolving the plastic. And then the purple tape measure, you'll see that even though I'm not getting purple much on the swab, you can see that there's a damaged area where I've rubbed the swab. And likewise, the back of that vanity set item, which is a cellulose nitrate kind of a plastic, is also damaged by solvents. So I don't put adhesive labels on plastics. There are often areas on plastics that you could put a tag or a label. In the upper right corner, I'm showing a yellow vinyl banner that has a grommet. So there's a perfect opportunity to put on a hanging tag. And if you're good with writing teeny, you might even be able to get away with putting adhesive label on the grommet. For example, this is another spot where I would use redundant labeling. So the housing that I would put this banner in, I'd also put the number there. Here are a couple of items of stone. Stone usually can take up adhesive label just fine. The item on the right is a whetstone from a shipwreck, and it took adhesive label fine. On the left is a large, heavy marble sculpture. So on that item, I would put the label low down on the side that isn't visible. And I would probably add some supplementary tags to help people understand which item that is without having to move it. Textiles and garments are where I also do a lot of sewn tags. And so on the right, I've kind of shown an example of how I would go in a seam that already has stitch holes, and I would try to reuse the same stitch holes that were on the object and not put new holes in the object. And I would kind of have a big loop on each end of the label. So instead of meticulously sewing down the label with a lot of stitches, I'm looking to have a big loop on each side. So I just need to snip those 2 big loops in order to get the label off if I wanted to get the label off again. I'm showing on the lower left a label that was written out for a textile and then stitched with black thread to a textile. The hanging items that include that purple shirt, you'll see these are hanging in a cabinet, and on their padded hangers, I've added an extra tag to have the number. So you wouldn't have to be looking around in the back of the neck of the garment or other places under the hem. Less handling, the better. It's great to have a well attached like sewn on label, but it's really great too to have an extra tag or label somewhere to know what number it is in storage quickly. Above that, in the upper left, I have rolled textiles. Rolled textiles, of course, prevent there from being folds in those textiles, and they can be a very efficient storage method, but it's very hard to see what you have. And it's also a lot of work to get those textiles out and unroll them and find a number that might be stitched on a corner or something like that. And so if you are rolling textiles, having that number on a supplementary tag on the outside is a great time saver and reduces handling on those textiles. I have seen collections where they even include like a little thumbnail picture on those tags of what the item is that's rolled up. And that's really top notch, really lovely. Here we have items made of wood. And if you have unpainted wood, it'll often take these adhesive labels just fine. But if you have stained or varnished or painted wood, like those surface coatings are going to react with a solvent you might want to use in the future to take that label off. So I wouldn't use an adhesive label anywhere that you have some other surface finish on already. The chair on the right side, I would put a tag up underneath on the unpainted surface underneath that chair, or I might consider putting a label on the back of one of those metal leg things that have the wheels on the bottom of the leg of the chair. That might be a good spot to put a number. And of course, I'd probably put a tag on the arm to notice easily. You'll see on the upper left, we've got these huge, I think those are deer patterns for a mine, and they're enormous and they're on these giant pallets. And there's most likely a tag, a label with adhesive inside one of those in an unobtrusive spot, but because they're so big and heavy, we've got supplementary tags on them saying their number. And then those really lovely dishes in the lower corner, those little grease dishes, there are just little pieces of cardstock folded to make like kind of a little tent shape that just sit inside those dishes. So when you open that drawer, you can kind of see at a glance what the numbers of those items are without having to pick them up and look on their underside. In the case of a number of those, sometimes the underside is unfinished and can take an adhesive label. So I think, yeah, so I'm going to stop screen sharing now. Stop sharing. Okay. Do we have anything exciting in the chat here? Haley's added a link to adjustable Japanese leather handle bookbinding. Is that another spin punch maybe? Anyway, we're about an hour in. And I'm going to say that if anybody wants to take a couple minutes and go to the bathroom or get a drink or anything like that, it's kind of maybe a good time for us to have a drink of water.
I think so. When would you like people back?
Oh, like 12:35 maybe?
12:35. Okay. We'll be back and we'll start again at 12:35 if you need to take a break. What are you going to cover next?
I'm gonna foolishly try to do a little bit of a demo, and then I'm gonna go into, because the camera just doesn't have a lot of detail, right? But at least, I can kind of talk people through the steps and they can get a little bit of a fuzzy idea what I'm doing. And then I'll screen share again and talk about a little bit of troubleshooting.
Okay.
And then maybe people will have questions about specific things or feedback or more thoughts.
We did get a request for your slides. I don't know if you're willing to share those.
Yeah, I think I could. Was it a request to everybody sort of thing? Or did it just come to you?
It just came to me. Yep.
Okay.
I think she was interested in looking at how you were, it came up when the baskets were up. So like how you're doing different things.
Yeah.
Actually, I'd like to get a copy too, if possible.
Who is
Selena.
that?
Selena, good.
Yeah.
He was the other person. So
So is the blue pencil used for labeling plastic-based photographs a special one, or can you just find in a set of pencil colors? I think maybe I'll wait till people get back and I'll answer that one. I think they're special. I don't think it's normal colored pencil. But I'll wait for people to come back. And then how did you label the yellowed round glass ball? I'll get to that one too when people come back. We're getting good stuff in the chat. And so my little clock says 12:35.
Yep.
I'm going
mine-
to get rolling again a little. We got some good questions in the chat. Angela Jane says, is the blue pencil used for labeling plastic-based photographs a special one or just one you can find in a set of pencil colors? I think it's a special one. I'm not a photo conservator, and so I don't know the history of this particular kind of pencil, but it is a special pencil. And strangely, it's this kind of mysterious to me. Maybe somebody knows why it says on the side of it, Prismacolor Premier non-photo blue PC 919. So I think it's a very specific kind of a pencil. I got this from an archival supply store. And so I think they are very specific, specially formulated pencils. I got a question here. How did you label the yellowed round glass ball? So that's a bead that had bead disease. And a lot of times if you have those bigger beads, you can just label with the tag through the hole in the middle of the bead. But in the case of that bead, I would have probably been putting that in a separate little, probably a little bag like this, and then maybe putting that in a box and maybe having some sort of a label that mentions that it's delicate. So I wouldn't label it directly. Something that's useful though, if you're labeling things that are strange shapes, one thing that you can do, and I'm going to do this large so you can see it better. Let's see if I can find a piece of paper that's big. Just doing this big so that you can see it. It's big. So let's say you're labeling something that's got a lot of curvature. You can either on the side of a table or your thumb, you can kind of scratch the back of to make the paper more curved. See how you can do that? So that way, like when you put the adhesive on the back, it's going to follow the curvature of the curved item better. Another thing that you can do is you can bend it in half the long way. So I don't know if you can see that I've just folded it in half the long way and it's kind of like a V shape on the edge. But now I can put it like, let's say I was trying to label like a pencil. Now it's going to stay on the curvature of that long skinny thing better because I folded it down the middle. Another thing that you can do, like let's say I was going to label that grommet on the vinyl banner that I had before. I'm looking for my writing implement. That's going to be so tiny. But just to give you an example of that, I'm making up a fake number. Let's say I had that number, it's hard to see it, written really tiny on a piece of paper. I could make a couple little cuts, cut almost all the way through it, and then try to go around the edge of something because I've now made the label in a couple different pieces, right? I might even have the label in a few different pieces. 2004-12-3 or something. You know, you don't have to have the label all in one go, as long as you have the number on there somehow, right? So for different sized and shaped things, you can manipulate the label. So that's a little bit of a handy thing. Can you clarify, Ashley's asking, can you clarify what the top coat is? Is it also the B72? And yes, I use B72 as the top coat as well. There are some museums that'll use B72 as the bottom coat because it's really reversible, and then they might use something different for the top coat. So sometimes you'll hear people complain that the solvent in the B72 on the top coat it interacts with the ink and makes it smear, or they want something that's easier to handle. But I find that if you're using two different adhesives, one for the bottom coat, one for the top coat, it adds complexity to the whole process of labeling. And it tends to be easier to just use the same thing for the bottom coat and the top coat. but that can be a preference. And I've heard of folks doing it different ways. There's a museum that I've heard of that used to coat their labels with Aquazol, which is a water-soluble adhesive, so that the ink wouldn't run when they put the bottom coat and the top coat on. So you do hear about people combining different adhesive choices, particularly in the top coat. But if you have ink that isn't going to smear with acetone, then using B72 for the bottom coat and B72 for the top coat is going to give you your best reversibility in the future and be the least amount of complication, I think. But there are different folks that do it different ways successfully. We have Sue is saying, hey, Ellen, Prismacolor makes exceptional colored pencils, but this one is specifically non-photo blue. Yes, it's a very specific pencil. I do think that just any colored pencil is not appropriate. Another question, sorry if I missed this, but does the craquelure on glazes increase chances of B72 causing staining of the ceramic body, and how can one prevent this? I have never seen B72 cause trouble or staining in the ceramic body if you have cracked glaze. I find that the cracked glaze is usually pretty robust and that the label goes on just fine over the top of it. I would be worried about adhesives that are in petroleum distillates really getting in there and causing staining on the ceramic body more than I would be concerned about B72, which I don't think is going to penetrate down into there. So I wouldn't worry about that. Is there a chance that that might have happened to somebody? Like possibly. It hasn't happened to me, and I've like labeled a bunch of shipwreck stuff and old ceramics that had cracks in it. It was okay. With the interleaving paper, this is an excellent question. I'm glad Haley brought this up. Would you ever print numbers on it from a printer, or do you only handwrite on it? I can imagine you could use a regular piece of paper as a carrier sheet to get it through the printer if the paper is too thin. I know encaustic artists who do this with tissue paper for their designs. And actually, Haley, printing out the number on a printer, I think is better than handwriting it if you can get away with doing it with the printer. I think it's really specific to whatever kind of printer you happen to have. And when I have previously taught this class, I've suggested people start out trying to put the tissue through a printer and seeing if they can find a printer in their building somewhere, because all printers aren't the same. Find a printer that'll print your numbers, because that way you can get really tiny fonts and the numbers are really, really readable. Because one of the big problems, of course, with handwritten numbers is that they can be confusing or not as legible as printed numbers. I will say, if you are hand printing numbers on these on the tissue and you're doing ABC for component parts, I really recommend that you go uppercase and not lowercase, because a lowercase b looks a lot like a 6, a lowercase l looks a lot like a 1, like that sort of thing. So I kind of recommend uppercase. And I recommend putting the like if you make a number 7, it's going to show up backwards anyway, but you know, you make a 7 and you can put they call that a flag when you put a little line through the middle of the 7. So things like that to enhance legibility. Another thing that I think is nice when you're, if you're handwriting the numbers, is to just sit down and like write them until you get one that you think looks really good. So because it's not right on the object already, I find that the more I'm writing, the clearer my, you know, as I kind of get into it, the numbers get tidier and they get smaller. And if I'm in the right zone and I'm not too caffeinated, you can really get on a roll and get some numbers that you're happy about. But to answer your question on that one, yeah, if you can get it through the printer, I think that's a better solution than handwriting your labels.
There's a follow-up one to that, lower.
Yeah.
About toner ink.
About what?
Is regular toner ink okay to use for this?
So what might happen is, depending on what kind of ink is going through your printer, the top coat might smear. So that's something that I've sometimes seen happen. Usually the ones that go through printers, I think, do all right, but it might smear, in which case it's not going to be a great technique. So instead of going through and discussing all the different kinds of inks that different printers might have, I would just say, see if your printer works. If you've got an ink that's going to print in a nice small font on your tissue and it can take a top coat, I think it's going to be all right. That's my feeling for it. And then there was a question, thoughts on rice paper for labels. And I have not experimented with rice paper. The only thing I can say with, and this is more for rice starch paste, sometimes that might get a little more yellow over time. Can't say for sure. I think rice paper might be possible. I think once you get it encapsulated in between 2 layers of B72, it's probably going to be okay. I have no further feedback on rice paper. Doesn't reproduce in photocopies. I'm not sure about photocopies. Mary Ellen, I don't think I totally understand the question about reproducing in photocopies. Tiffany says, based on my high school journalism days, I always thought you label photos with the blue because it doesn't show up when copied and printed. Oh, that must be what Mary Ellen means, doesn't reproduce in photocopies. Interesting. That's really cool. I had no idea. See, you learned something new with giving a workshop. I'm totally going to try that after this class. I'm going to go see if it reproduces. Supposedly the blue lines on graph paper don't reproduce on copies either. Is regular toner ink okay? Inkjet was not. Toner was acceptable, inkjet was not. This might be a smearing issue. I'm not sure. Castro Viejo scissors. Wow. Those sound great. Wow. Nice. So Mary Ellen Frank has put something in the chat about some really nice scissors. Okay, that was pretty great stuff in the feedback. So now we're at about 12:47 is what my clock says. And the workshop, I guess, wraps up in a little more than a half an hour or so. So I'd kind of like to show you as best I can live how I put a label on something. And then I'll go back to a screen share and show you some better images on PowerPoint of labeling and of some troubleshooting sort of stuff. So as I mentioned before, I kind of like make a little list of numbers if I'm going to handwrite them. And then I take my really nice Sharpity sharp scissors and I kind of cut them into a fringe. And I find that makes them easy to keep track of and easy to handle. And then I can just cut free the one that I want to use when I'm ready to use the one that I want to use. And it also allows me to trim it down and take off any excess paper if I want to. And a combination of using your little tweezers and trimming down is kind of a nice combo too. And then I usually have this set down on a surface near where I'm working. And I'm going to kind of use this coffee mug to demonstrate. So I'm not going to put it right on the foot because the foot is going to get like wear and tear and be directly on the surface. So if I can put it up in the dented part, there is where I'm going to put it. And I've got my adhesive. Like when I open it up, and different people have different things that work for them. So I'm just showing you what I like to do. And I'm going to take that brush out and I'm only going to wipe off one side of it. So then the side that still has, that's been unwiped is the side that I'm going to use to go on here and make what I like to call the landing strip. And I'm going to make a strip that's a little bit wider than my label. So you're not going to be able to see it on there, I'm sorry. But now, as you remember, I wiped off one side of this brush and then the other side of the brush that had some adhesive, I made my landing strip. And now I'm going to take the same brush and I'm going to touch it to the top of the label. And I'm going to pick it up. See how I just had enough adhesive to pick it up? And then I'm going to set it on there. I set it right on there. And I'm going to tap, 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 tap with the brush to put it on there. Does that sort of make sense? So my process there was when I pulled out the brush, I only wiped one side of the brush. And then the side of the brush that I didn't wipe was where I put my landing strip. And then I took that brush and boink, picked up the label and set it on the landing strip. And then I kind of tapped it down. And then I would go in again and I'd do the same thing. And I'd only wipe off one side of the brush. So the side of the brush that's still loaded, I would flip over and that's what I would put on the top coat with. And I might need to do that a second time to make sure that I got it sealed all the way around. And I'm going to remind us again of the Band-Aid. This nice big fat Band-Aid, which I think I've really stuck down to this packaging. So the Band-Aid having sticky all the way around the edges so that, you know, if this was going on your cut and you put it on your knee that's been scraped, it's really going to hold it all in. So that's kind of what I'm going for with that label. If I was going to take this off again, I'd have a cotton swab and I've got my thing of acetone. Let me pull this out of the kit. I have my little thing of acetone and I put the little swab right on the little opening hole. I kind of turn it upside down and watch as that swab got all wet. And then I would go and sort of take it off so, and it also helps if it gets a little bit wet and starts to come off, you can kind of grab it with your little tweezers and take it back off again too. So that's kind of the movements that I use to do it. And I'm going to try to share my screen again and show you a little bit of troubleshooting. Let's see. Can you see my screen again?
Yes.
Okay, good. So, okay, now it's not going. Okay, so there's my little fringe. Are you seeing this? The fringe of numbers. So some of them came out a little nicer, some of them came out not so nice. And so you can kind of pick and choose the one that you like to cut out and put on your object. And then this is kind of showing, you know, on the far left, how I've kind of done the landing strip. And then I pick up the little label with the tip of my brush, and I'm just going to set it right in place on top of that landing strip. That's kind of what these images are showing. And then after I set it down on there, I'm going to sort of tap it into place and put on the top coat. Here's a little troubleshooting. This is the biggest problem that I think we see with using B72. Sometimes it gets bubbly. And I have never heard, if somebody has like definitive opinion on this, please put it in the chat or say so out loud. What causes this bubbling? I'm not sure what causes this bubbling. Demons maybe. But a couple of things. For one thing, like let's say you're mixing up your B72 and it's like kind of thick. And so you add some more acetone to it, or you shake it up. Shaking it up, I think, introduces bubbles. So if you think you're going to be labeling the next day, shake it up the day before. Like shaking it up before you use it, I think invites there to be bubbles. So I think that's one problem. I've heard people say if there's too much airflow in the room, or too much of a breeze or whatnot, you're going to get too much evaporation and bubbles are going to get trapped. I've heard people talk about that. If I am labeling like this and I start getting this bubbly thing going on, I switch to my other jar and use that instead. Sometimes adding a little bit of acetone to your brush before you dip it in can sometimes help a little bit. Although if I'm getting that trouble consistently, I'm probably going to add a bunch of acetone to my B72, shake it up, and try again the next day. So if anybody has opinions on what to do if the B72 gets bubbly or what they think authentically causes that to happen, I've always been curious about that. And I haven't ever gotten a straight answer about it from people who seem to know these things. This is the other big thing that you'll sometimes see, is that the ink will smear. So that's a matter of the ink being soluble in the acetone that is the solvent for the B72. So the two solutions for that are to use a different kind of an ink. So if this is what's coming out of your printer, trying a different printer or handwriting the label with an archival pen is a solution, and another solution, if you really love using this particular printed number, is to top coat with something different that's in a different substance besides acetone. So those are really your only two options if you're getting smearing like that, is to change the ink or change the top coat. This is an example of something that's already got some labels in it. You'll see that somebody has written Roman numeral 2B1139 in ink on the back of this drum. And then in the inside on the right of the image, you'll see this old red edged adhesive kind of sticker label. I would leave it. I'd leave both of those, and I wouldn't remove either one of them. And you see there's a supplementary tag in there on a string. The red edged labels, our own collection has a lot of those that are rectangular, kind of cornerless ones. So it's like a rectangle, and then the edges, the corners are kind of gone, but it has a red edge around the whole thing. And a lot of those are written in ink that look like they're written in an old quill pen. And I feel like those are really coming from a very specific time period in our collection's history. And so it really ties that item to that time period, or maybe specific collectors even. So generally speaking, I'm not removing old labels when I see them. The ink label that's in here, I think that's not even going to completely come out easily. It's going to be hard to get off. So generally speaking, old labels I leave in place. This is something that if you're interested in it, I've got it in more detail, and I can email you sort of a text version of the report on this. This is some research that I did, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago on other kinds of adhesives for labeling collections besides B72. So you'll see here we used pennies for, you know, the copper coating on them. We used stone. We used broken flower pots as kind of unglazed ceramic. There's a bunch of teeth. There's a bunch of bones. We used popsicle sticks, and we put adhesives of about 10 or 12 different kinds of adhesives that we tried on these substrates. And then you'll see from the index cards on the right, just trying to remove those with solvents. If we wanted to get those labels back off, we submerged a whole group of these things in water to mimic what would happen in a flood. Would the labels come off if they got wet? We put another set of them in a humidity chamber to experiment with kind of a high relative humidity situation, like if you had a really damp summer, for example, or they were in a flood situation but didn't get directly wet, just high humidity. We put a whole bunch of them in the lab oven to mimic high temperature, which is also kind of a way of artificially aging things. And we went after that last batch along the bottom with a toothbrush to simulate abrasion. So this was the sample set that I did here in Juneau. There was another very similar sample set that was done by a student, Anne Marie Weiss, in the Queen's University Conservation Training Program. And then a third set was done by Samantha Springer at the Cleveland Museum of Art. And so we came up with results and pros and cons to these adhesives, these alternate adhesives, and we put them as a poster at the Alaska Anthropological Association conference that year, because generally I was trying to address questions we were getting from archaeologists who wanted to use things like art store acrylic gloss medium and things that have nicer handling properties, particularly water-based things that are easy to clean up, that people preferred to use. And they said, can we use this adhesive instead of B72? Or can we use this other adhesive? Like, what are the options? And instead of saying, no, the rule is use B72, that's better, just take my word for it, I think it's more useful if people have very concrete reasons and pros and cons and advantages and disadvantages of different materials. So that was what that research was about. And there's a website, I have a WordPress blog that I put a lot of my work on. And so there's a link there, or it doesn't work. It's not like you can click on it, but there's a report and images online in more detail as to what happens if you use these other kinds of adhesives. So here's like the bone example with all these different labels that we put on with different kinds of adhesives. Regal Res was a adhesive that we were using that was in petroleum distillates, for example, instead of in acetone, and we got migration of the adhesive in strange places and odd staining. And of course, petroleum distillates have a really intense smell and they take a long time to fully dry. So those were some of the disadvantages for that one. This was Liquitex gloss medium, and it was really difficult to remove. A lot of things that are water-based don't reverse well. They will, instead of dissolving again, they will swell and turn into like a gel or a goo that you can sometimes pick off the surface, but sometimes they're difficult to pick off the surface. This is Liquitex matte medium on bone. And so when we tried to reverse it, it swells into a goo in the pores of the bone. And when you try to peel it off, it peels off the surface of the bone. So those are a couple examples of alternate adhesives and what some of the testing findings were. This is Roplex, which is another water-based adhesive that people kind of like to use. And it contains, as a lot of acrylics do, I guess, ammonia as part of the formulation, which reacts with copper. So you'll see that there's a kind of a darkened area of discoloration on the penny, and then that greenish in the adhesive film there shows that some of the copper was being pulled out into the adhesive. So kind of not a great choice for labeling metals like that. That's the end of the PowerPoint there. This is my contact info. I'm pretty easy to find on the internet, and I'm easy to call as well. And people always seem surprised to hear this, but it's part of my job to provide expertise and information to museums and cultural centers and the general public. Like, part of the reason that the state of Alaska is willing to fund the Alaska State Museum is they want us to be of service to the public. So people are supposed to call me and write to me and ask me questions. And it's one of my favorite parts of the job, actually. I'm going to stop the screen sharing here and see what else we've got in chat here. Doesn't acetone dissolve varnishes? Acetone could also interact with wood oils. Yes, yes, and yes, this is true. And so I wouldn't use B72 directly on things that are thought to be varnished or things that could be soluble in acetone. With some kinds of wood objects, particularly furniture, there are unfinished surfaces, like up underneath the seat of the chair, for example, will often be unfinished, or the back of a picture frame might have areas of unfinished wood, or the stretcher or strainer on a picture frame might be unfinished wood. But if you are dealing with painted surfaces or varnished surfaces, those are not appropriate surfaces to use B72 on. Do you use B67 for anything? And you know, if Helen Alton is still on here, she might remember. I think B67 is in a petroleum distillate, and I think people do use it for marking certain things. But I find that using petroleum distillates is like really stinky. Even if you've got like fume extractors or a snorkel or a fume hood or something like that, I find it an unpleasant smell, and it tends to give me a headache, and it's very slow to dry. And I am kind of not that big of a fan of it, but I think that there are applications that people might use it. I just have never used it and found it useful. Let's see. I think those were the questions we had in chat. And I think that's most of what I had to share with you today. Does anybody have stuff that they're labeling or working with that they want to ask about, or that they're concerned about, or they're procrastinating, trying to put numbers on because it's pain? Anything like that?
So we have a lot of plastic at our museum because, you know, we're a toy museum, and so everything, you know, sort of newer is plastic, and so we don't mark that a lot, or we don't mark that at all unless it's a plastic that takes pencil easily, because it will come off, but about half plastics will not take
Yeah.
any pencil at all. Have you ever used any sort of wax pencils on anything that's, it's a non-porous surface. Is that something you would not recommend?
Well, I think if you're going to put something on, the question is how are you going to get it back off again? So, if we're thinking of a wax-based thing, the first thing my mind goes to is like it might be able to rub off, but then it might also rub off when you don't want it to rub off, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think identifying plastics can be really tricky. And so feeling confident about what you'd be applying to that and having confidence that it's going to come off. Another thing is that plastics age and like they lose plasticizers and they cross-link and things happen to plastics over time. So I would also be worried that what might come on and off of a plastic when it's new, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, might not be coming off as well. So I guess in the case of plastics, I'd be looking to see if you've got any kind of a element on there that could take like maybe something that's metal that could take a label easier. Having things be in boxes and bags that you can label the redundant things, having images, putting hang tags on things, like all those kinds of options. Like I would generally err on the side of not using adhesives on plastic. I'm seeing in the chat people saying they would rather create a tissue enclosure and staple it closed with a Japanese stapler and just write on the paper. So one of the things about a tissue enclosure and stapling things closed, I'm not sure what a Japanese stapler is. That's really curious. So a couple thoughts on wrapping things in tissue. So if you wrap something up in tissue, you can't see it. So you can't see what's inside the tissue. And so when you're unwrapping it again, you're unwrapping it blind. If it's something that's delicate or something, like you really don't know what you have until you've partially unwrapped it. And also unwrapping something gives the risk that it might fall while you're in the process of manipulating to unwrap something. So that's one thought with wrapping things in tissue. And then as far as staples go, staples are introducing something kind of sharp into your collection storage thing. So being aware of that, and also being aware if you have a water incident, staples can rust. Paper clips do the same thing. So there's caveats to using tissues and using staplers. I will say though, I had an experience in Osaka, Japan, in a museum there where I went to see behind the scenes in this museum. And it was really high-end collections care sort of thing. Like they made you take off your shoes and put on little slippers and super high-end collection storage. And a lot of what they were using to make storage supports and cradle things and pad things out, there was like Japanese tissue everywhere, like tissue solutions and folded paper solutions were all over the place. And I said to the collections care person, wow, like, do you ever use Volara foam or do you ever use Mylar? There's silicone release Mylar. Do you use Corex or foam core or like all these sort of materials, right? And she was really polite, but she was like, we've been using Japanese tissue for thousands of years and it's worked pretty good for us. And I was like, okay, point taken. Japanese tissue and acid-free tissues and acid-free paper boards have a lot of utility in collection storage and are really proven materials. So thumbs up to that. Edwina says the Japanese stapler has no metal staples. Okay, well, I'm totally going to check this out then. I'm very curious about the staple-free stapler. Nice.
Someone unmuted to ask a question? Okay. Do you have any more questions? There are no bad questions.
So people can either find me by Googling me or, ellen.carrlee@alaska.gov. I guess there still are some label kits if people want a label kit. If people have specific questions or they want to send me pictures of things they're trying to label, or where to order things from, or any of that kind of stuff, you can totally ask me anytime. I love those kinds of questions. Oh, somebody says, Haley says, what are your thoughts on IdentiPens? We use black. I don't know IdentiPens directly, but I would say if you are finding success with them, if they are writing on your paper and they're not smearing, then they're probably okay. Sharpies are not necessarily long lasting and archival, and generally they're not considered great pens to be using. Also, ballpoint pens that are blue or colored in any way, those inks fade really, really fast, shockingly fast. Like you might even want to write on a piece of paper and tape it up in a window and kind of do your own little demo about how quickly colored inks don't last, but that's something to think about. And then Haley says she uses IdentiPens to write on CDs and sometimes plastics, but cautiously. Huh. Yeah, there are a lot of publications written on inks and ink standards, and I find that a little bit hard to keep up with. And another thing is that companies that are making things commercially don't need to tell you what's in their products, and they can change what's in their products kind of at any time. So it's very difficult to keep up with what a product actually is. So knowing that B72 is an inert reversible kind of conservation approved material, and then sort of sandwiching the label between two layers of that on many surfaces is pretty desirable. And with hang tags, there's nothing wrong with using pencil on a hang tag. I think that it kind of gets around the question of if an ink is going to run if it gets wet, or if it's going to fade with time. So just some thoughts on inks and whatnot. Hopefully people are feeling confident about labeling their collections, and maybe having a coffee mug or something about to flex your labeling muscle with before you actually put something on an object, to hone your skills on object labeling day. I find coming in fresh in the morning and feeling confident is great for object labeling. And I guess if I don't have more questions, maybe we'll just let people go.
That works for us. Big thank you to you,
Hey,
Ellen.
Ellen.
Hey, Nico.
Hey, sorry, can I just ask you one question?
Yeah.
This is a little bit of a philosophical question, and I guess practical as well. But in school, we're kind of drilled in to have every object labeled on itself. What are your thoughts? I know you mentioned kind of duplicate labeling, but what about when you just don't think the object can really handle a label? And what does that mean for kind of the future of the collection and the possibility of disassociation?
Yeah, well, it is true that in school, they're like every object needs to have a number firmly attached to the object. And I would take that like a step further and say, why? And so the why is so that you don't dissociate the object from all its information. And so if it were to get stolen, it would have an identifier on it, hopefully. So thinking of the reason behind why the training programs are so adamant to put a label directly on the item, and going back to that goal, the reason you want to label on it, and is there another way to achieve that goal, which is why I'm into redundant packaging and labeling and hang tags, photographs, really good descriptions in the database, like all those sorts of redundant things. So the more reluctant I am to put something directly on an object with V72, the more obsessive I'm going to get about a lot of redundant labeling and making sure I have a good photo of that object and that sort of thing. So if I can't get a number directly attached to the object in a secure way, and I'm forced, because it's plastic or it's got a flaking surface, I'm forced to use a less than ideal numbering technique, I'm going to become more obsessive with the redundant stuff.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah. And thank Tiffany for saying just silence doesn't mean boredom. I kind of am feeling a little bit like a crazy lady talking to myself for the last hour.
You did just such a good job. We don't have any questions because we were blown away.
Yep. Sounds like everyone is excited to get started with their rocks or their mugs. Wonderful. Okay. Well, I guess we'll let everyone go. Thank you, Ellen. Many
Thanks,
claps.
folks. And
Yeah.
thanks for your cool suggestions and things I hadn't heard of before. Thank